Okay, so on Wednesday we left off here talking about the role of the stems. We had already talked about the role of the roots, and that the roots' role is to anchor the plant to the ground, acquire water and nutrients, and that there were two types. Okay? The taproot, which is the long central root with the tiny little root hairs coming off, okay, that really is more for storing nutrients and energy as opposed to like actually acquiring any water and nutrients, because most things with a taproot are small. Okay. The other type was the fibrous roots, okay, and lots of big trees have those. We talked about how the saguaro cactus has those. Grass, okay, is a fibrous root system, right? Things like that. And then we started talking about the role of the stem here, where we talked about the stem's role. Certainly it's green, so it does carry out some photosynthesis, but not a significant amount, okay? Its main job is to be tough, hard, and support the foliage that is actually carrying out photosynthesis. Okay, it is also the place where new tissue can grow from. Okay, in the form of the buds there that we talked about, the axillary buds. There's also terminal buds on the tips. Okay, but if something were to come along and graze on this particular plant and cut it off right here, as we see is done in this picture, okay, those axillary buds will cause new foliage to grow to replace that which was consumed. Okay. The big thing for the stem in terms of the cells that are present in that tissue is that they have a lot more lignin than most do. Their water vacuoles will be a lot bigger than most because they need that extra turgor pressure, okay, because their job is primarily to support the plant. Also within the stem are the two sets of tubes. Okay, there's a set of tubes for conducting water, because water has to move up, and there's a set of tubes for conducting sugary sap, which has to move downwards. All right, so obviously they can't travel in the same tubes if they're going different directions. Okay, and we'll talk about the xylem, which carries water, and the phloem, which carries sugar here in a little bit. Okay, questions on role of the stem? All right, so within the leaf, and I think we actually got to this slide. I think you guys were the only class that did. Okay, we're talking about the structure of the leaf. Am I going to need to know the layers in the structure of the leaf? Yes, you are going to have to know the layers. And this is what we looked at under the microscope yesterday. Okay, we looked at exactly this thing, and we saw that there were these rectangular cells. Okay, and underneath the cells were a bit more randomly shaped, and they were kind of all over the place. Okay, and if we were fortunate enough, we may have actually seen in the center of the leaf, okay, this structure. Okay, and in this structure here, okay, which would be like a vein, we see the two sets of tubes. All right, the set of tubes on the outside is the phloem. That's what carries the sugar that's produced, okay, by the leaf, and the inside set of tubes carries water, and that's the xylem. All right, now the reason for this, it's way easier for water to move through all of these cells and get out here than it is for sugar, which is bigger, thicker, heavier, to move all the way through to the middle and go down the central tubes. All right. Plus, these central tubes are dead. Okay. There's actually no like living cells usually in the xylem, so there's no need for sugar to be in there. Sugar travels down. Okay, the phloem, which is alive and thus needs sugar and things like that. All right, does that sort of make sense for the arrangement? Okay, the other benefit of having the water inside and the sugar outside is that sometimes varying conditions can cause the sugary sap to thicken. All right, and if that happens, it doesn't flow very well, and that can lead to the roots and the other parts of the plant not getting enough sugar. So if a little bit more water, if that starts to happen, more water will move by osmosis naturally across and into those cells, and that'll thin the sap and allow it to run more freely. Right? So all of these things work really quite smartly. All right. So the things we need to know. Okay, the leaf on both sides, here and here, is covered by the cuticle. Okay, the cuticle is not made of cells. The cuticle is a waxy secretion. Okay, so these cells here in the upper epidermis secrete this wax. Okay, so they produce it, and it just forms a layer on the top of the leaf. Okay, and just like chapstick, okay, it seals the moisture in so that moisture can't evaporate off of the leaf, which means that the plant can control how much water evaporates while it's carrying out photosynthesis, and it won't dry out. Okay, the harsher the conditions the plant lives in, the thicker the cuticle is going to be. Okay, on a cactus, the cuticle is really thick. Okay, if you've ever touched a cactus, not the prickly part, okay, the fleshy part, you'll probably notice that it's very hard. Okay, and if you like scrape it with your fingernail, a whole bunch of kind of clear stuff comes off. Right, and that's the waxy cuticle that you've scraped off. Right? Everyone with me on that? So they all secrete this. It helps to seal in the moisture. So that's really all the epidermis does, is creates a layer that prevents evaporation and loss of water. Okay, the layer underneath, and we said before, you don't need to remember this word, mesophyll. Okay, just remember that this layer underneath is the Palisade layer. That's where the cells are stacked really, really close together, up and down. Okay, and it looks a lot like a certain type of rock formation called Palisades. That's where it got the name from. Okay, where there's columns of stone. So these are columns of cells. Okay, and that's where the bulk of the photosynthesis takes place. Okay, so this layer, okay, is responsible for the bulk of this. Okay, this layer secretes the cuticle. Underneath the Palisade layer is the spongy layer. Okay, and in the spongy layer is where essentially all the needed material is kept. Okay, and where it can move easily because the spongy layer is full of a lot of water. Right, and then carbon dioxide, sugar, oxygen, all that stuff that's being traded and produced and used in the Palisade layer can move freely. Right, so generally, since these cells are carrying out photosynthesis, they're using up carbon dioxide. Agreed? So if carbon dioxide moves in through these things called the stomates, which we'll talk about in a minute, the carbon dioxide will naturally diffuse this direction. Right? Because diffusion always moves from high to low. So if it's being used up, it's naturally going to move through the spongy layer and into the Palisade layer. Similarly, these cells, as they use up use up carbon dioxide, produce oxygen. So there's lots of oxygen here, not as much down here, and so oxygen moves the other way. Right, so we got this movement of those two gases past each other through the spongy layer, and they enter and exit through the stomate. Okay, it says stoma here, but that's plural. Okay, stomate is singular. Okay, since it's only pointing at one, right, we'll call that stomate. The stomate is made up of two special cells. Okay, the cells are called guard cells, and you can see that they're labeled that way. And I think we talked about this on Wednesday as well. As the plant carries out photosynthesis and uses up water, the water vacuoles in the guard cells begin to drain. And as they drain, they can't push on the cell walls of the guard cells as hard, and the shape of the cells changes. And changes in such a way that it closes the stomate, so that oxygen, carbon dioxide can't move, water vapor can't move, and essentially photosynthesis shuts down and the plant stops losing water. Right? Everyone follow me there? Obviously, it doesn't want to do that for very long. It needs to carry out photosynthesis to live. Okay, but it's good if it got really, really hot on a particular day and it just needs to, slow down a little bit and save some water. All right, is that making some sense? All right, so we need to know what all of these layers do. The spongy layer really just allows the movement of materials, storage of a little bit of water. Okay, and the stomates, they control the evaporation of water. Okay, they open and close, controlling the evaporation of water. Is it a conscious choice of the plant to open and close the stomates? Nope, it isn't. It just happens. Okay, the reason it happens is as the water evaporates from the cell, or from the area around it, okay, the cytoplasm in the cell becomes saltier. Okay, because it's lost some water. And so that naturally causes water to move out of the water vacuole by what process? Not diffusion. Osmosis, right? Okay, so the osmotic pressure draws it out of the water vacuole, and that changes the shape of the cell and naturally closes off, okay, the stomate. Plants don't make conscious decisions. Stuff just happens, okay, and it all relies on all these cellular transport processes that we talked about earlier: diffusion, osmosis, okay, things like that. All right, one other thing here. This terminology here. Okay, if I'm looking at a leaf. Okay, that's not bad. It actually looks half leaf-like. Okay, this here is the blade. So if you imagine it's a shovel, okay, that's the blade of the shovel. Okay, the stalk, okay, is this part here, and the petiole is where the stalk joins the branch, okay, or the main part of the stem. Okay. We're not going to ask you about C4 leaves. C4 leaves are different. In fact, they're not really leaves. Okay, this is what you would see in a cactus. Right? Does a cactus have a much bigger issue with saving water? Yeah. Okay. So you can see that they've got actually vast openings here that are basically just filled with air. All right. Their Palisade layer wraps around their veins. Okay, their spongy layer is a lot smaller. Okay, and so it's more protected, okay, from the harmful effects of heat and sunlight and things like that. Okay, and you can see their stomates aren't made of 2 guard cells; they're made of 4. All right, so it's quite a bit more adapted to controlling the loss of water. We're not going to worry about that. This is the diagram of the leaf structure you're going to need to know. Okay, so transport in plants. So plants moving stuff. Here's where that polar nature of water, osmosis, and all that stuff is really going to come into play. All right. This picture here, okay, you can see the scale here. This much space is 100 micrometers. Okay, that means it's about the size of your euglena or so. Okay, your euglena was probably somewhere between like 60 and 90 micrometers, somewhere in there. Okay, so this much space here, okay, so if I just draw a line there and now I can move it around, okay, is 100 micrometers. Those are the xylem tubes in that picture. The tubes that carry water from the bottom of the tree to the top of the tree. Are they pretty small? Okay, they have to be. Okay, the tubes inside of a plant can't be like a Slurpee straw. Okay, I mean, if you want to draw a Slurpee or a thick milkshake through a straw, okay, do you have to produce a fair amount of suction? Yeah, and if that straw is really long, or it's really one of those big fat ones, it's even harder, because you've got a lot of fluid within the straw that has to be supported by something, and that something is the suction you're producing. All right, plants don't produce a suction, so they can't be supporting large columns of water because they're too heavy. But if the tubes are really, really small, the polar nature of water will support the weight of the column, okay? Because the column is, again, really, really small, okay? So what will happen is, inside of these tubes, okay, we'll have cohesion happening, so water molecules being hydrogen bonded together, and we'll have a lot of adhesion going on as well, where the water molecules are hydrogen bonded to the edges of the tube. Okay, and that will support that column of water. Now, are there lots and lots of little tubes? Yeah. So really, we're talking about a fair amount of water being in the trunk of the tree. All right. We don't see that when we cut it down, but it still is a fair amount of water. Okay, that's being held in there. There's a lot of moisture. If you've ever tried to start a fire, okay, with freshly cut live wood, is it hard? Yeah. It's full of water, and if you actually do get it to burn, it spits and cracks and does all kinds of stuff because there's so much moisture in there that when you get it hot, it expands, turns into water vapor, and cracks the wood, spits sparks everywhere, okay, all that kind of stuff. That's why all that goes on. There's a lot of moisture held up in here because a plant needs a lot of it. Okay, everyone with me there so far? All right. So in your notes, okay, you've got essentially this set of steps. Okay, should be right beside that diagram in your notes package. Yeah? Okay, so I'm not going to have the steps up. I'm going to have the picture up. Okay, so we'll start down here with step number 1. Step number 1 is the movement of water into the roots. Okay, the way the roots do that is they actually secrete some ions, usually like hydrogen ions and things like that, near their edges, near their surface. And that draws water in by what process? Osmosis, right? Because we get kind of a salty situation going on in the roots that draws water into the roots. Okay? Then, as that gets balanced, okay, the water can begin to move into the xylem tissue, okay, from the root. Now, once that situation has been balanced, and it happens pretty quickly, there starts to become a pull from above. All right? The pull from above has to do with this going on, with actually step 4. As water evaporates from the surface of the leaf, it changes state from liquid to gas. While it's doing that, it is still hydrogen bonded to other water molecules below it. So as it leaves through the stomates and tries to get out into the open air, it creates a tugging, pulling force, okay, on the water molecules below it, okay, pulling them just a little bit higher up the xylem before that hydrogen bond breaks. Okay, those water molecules will adhere to the inside of the xylem and not fall back down. So there's this kind of leapfrog kind of process that goes on, okay, through the xylem that brings the water up. Okay, now why does the water want to move towards the leaf, though? The water that gets absorbed through the roots, is it just water or does it have stuff in it? It's got stuff in it. And I mean, dirt's full of all kinds of salts and things like that. Okay? When you evaporate water, like if you accidentally boiled away a whole bunch of water in a pan, what gets left behind? Does anything get left behind in the pan? Yeah, all the salts that were in it, right? Okay, and we live in a place where the water's pretty hard, so there's actually a fair amount of kind of white deposit that's left behind. Okay, well, as water evaporates from the tree, it doesn't take those minerals with it. Those minerals stay behind here in the leaf, okay, and make it salty. And what does the water want to do? It wants to balance the salts by what process? Osmosis, right? Okay, so osmosis is not only creating a force that pulls water in at the roots, it's creating a pulling force in the leaves that's drawing that water up the plant. Okay, so the combination of osmotic pulling force, okay, cohesion and adhesion, polar nature of water, okay, is what allows a tree, or any plant for that matter, to draw water from the roots to the leaves. Okay, and when we're talking about a really big plant, that's a long way. Okay? It's a lot of force. But remember, each individual tube is still microscopic. Okay? We're talking maybe 20 micrometers across. Okay? It can't be any bigger than that. Right? Because realistically, guys, if you made them any bigger, there would just be, again, too much weight to support by hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds aren't that strong. Okay? They're fine with small amounts, but not with big amounts. And it's the same issue that we would have if we were trying to support a column of water by drinking out of a straw that was, let's say, this big. Okay, not only would you have a hard time actually getting your mouth around something that big, but okay, it would be tough, okay, to create enough suction to support the weight of the water that would be in that straw. Okay? Now, if you have a really tiny straw, is it pretty easy to draw water up a really, really small one? It is, because the weight of the column is very light. Okay? Obviously, you don't get the same volume because it's not as big, okay? But if you had a whole bunch of them, okay, it would be. Okay, once we get the water to the leaves, then this process can go on. Okay, photosynthesis requires water. All right, because we're trying to turn carbon dioxide into glucose. Well, we need some hydrogen for that. Okay, and that comes from the water. All right, so some of the water that's coming to the leaf actually gets used in photosynthesis, and some of it, okay, just takes off. All right, so that produces our C6H12O6, okay, and oxygen. All right, so that hydrogen's got to come from there. Okay, so we're using some of the water to produce glucose. Okay, so once we get the water to the leaves, some of it's producing pulling force, some of it's being used in photosynthesis, okay, which is essentially this step, the formation of sugar. Once the sugar is produced, it begins to naturally move back towards the phloem. Okay, again, it's a matter of diffusion. It's very concentrated in the palisade layer of the leaf, and there's not very much of it in the phloem by comparison. So it moves into there. Once it's in the phloem, diffusion doesn't matter anymore. It's in the phloem, gravity takes over. Okay, and gravity pulls that heavy, sticky, syrupy sap down the phloem to the roots. Okay, you've all got sap on your fingers at some time in your life, right? Okay, I mean, you know, it's really, really sticky. Okay, that's because it's full of sugar. Right? That's why we make maple syrup out of it. Right? When you see, you know, those the commercials, you know, where they show someone tapping a tree, okay, and they're, you know, draining the sap out of it, the maple trees. Okay, is that a fast process or a slow process? It's really slow. We get this idea that you jam the tap in, crank it open, and it comes out like water, okay? But it doesn't. I mean, you hang a bucket from that thing and you wait a couple of days, right? And it, you know, it's maybe a little bit full when you get there. That's why real maple syrup is so much more expensive than the fake kind, right? But it is still a process. How far in do you suppose that tap goes? Because that's the other thing we don't really think about much. We see someone putting a tap in a tree and we think, man, are they driving that thing like all the way into the middle? How far in does it go? Okay, it actually only goes in a little bit. Because if it goes into the middle, is it going to be getting the syrupy sap? No, it's going to be getting the watery sap, and we don't want that. We can get water anywhere. We don't need to get it out of a tree. Okay, so we want the sugary sap, and that's on the outside. So if I'm looking at a tree, okay, from the top down, okay, the phloem, the part that carries the sugary sap, is the very outside. Okay, it's on the very outside. Everyone with me there? That's why you often see sap leaking out. You know, if a tree has been chewed on by a deer or someone's hit it with something, right? Sap always kind of comes out of the wound. Okay, well, that's because they've damaged the phloem, right? And the phloem is right on the outside. All right, so like we said, two tissues, and you can see here this is a way better diagram than mine. Okay, the xylem is here in the middle, okay, and the phloem is on the outside. And in fact, the xylem is really just old phloem cells. Okay, the phloem is alive, the xylem is dead, right? And so the xylem essentially is old phloem cells because the tree grows outwards from the outside every year. It adds on another layer. That's why we get the tree rings. Okay, the tree can't grow from the inside because if it's growing and adding more from the inside, what's it going to do to the outside? It's going to break it. Yeah, it'll crack, right? That's not what trees normally do. Okay, so they always add a layer on to the outside, and that's how they get bigger and bigger. Okay, now we kind of had a thing when I was in university where we had a guy, we called him tree mugger, not tree hugger, tree mugger. Okay, he was in the forestry faculty. That's why he was called tree mugger. Okay, anyway, we had this nice field behind our dorm, where we would kind of, we would go outside, we'd play football, horse around, whatever, and then the biosciences, the botany department decided they were going to transplant all these really big trees, okay, from somewhere, I don't know where. And they were going to put them in this nice field, okay? And so they put like 10, 12, 14 trees in this field and made it completely useless for what we wanted. We tried to play football, we kept running into trees, which is painful. Okay? So we got kind of choked about that they'd transferred these stupid trees from somewhere. So this tree mugger guy says, hey, I got a way to get rid of those trees. I'm like, well, we can't just go cut them down with a chainsaw. We'll get caught. Okay? He said, no. We'll go out there in the middle of the night and we'll ring them. I'm like, I don't want to marry that tree. No, he said, ring it. It means you just cut a little bit into it. Okay? Only about this far, all the way around. And then the sap can't get to the roots, and the tree will die. And we're like, well, you're the forestry guy. Okay? You're probably right about that. So we did. And the trees started getting really, really sick. So we're like, sweet, pretty soon these trees will be gone. They'll cut them down. We'll get our field back. I know that's really selfish, but that's how we were thinking at the time. Well, anyway, it ended up being this really big deal. They brought in all these people from the botany department to fix the trees. Okay? To save the trees, these stupid trees. Anyway, they brought in and they made this paper mache skin graft that went over the ring we had made on these trees. Okay? And so it was just like, have you guys ever made paper mache? Okay, it's like newspaper with water and cornstarch and whatever, right? And see, they put that over the things, and then they put these fences around the tree so we couldn't take it off. Yeah, it actually grew. The trees, in the 4 years I was there, the trees actually grew bark right over the paper mache. But you could see the newspaper writing and stuff in the bark that grew over this stuff. Okay, so unfortunately the trees are still there. But yeah, this is, if you take away that phloem, if you cut that phloem in any way, the tree will die. Right? Which is why you never see a deer eat all the way around a tree. They'll usually pick one side. Okay? Because if they go all the way around, the tree will die. Okay? Somehow they know that. So anyway, I never told you that story. I had nothing to do with that, because there was a big article in the paper and everything about someone trying to kill these trees, and we're like, God, you're talking about them like they're people, they're trees. But anyway, okay, inside is where obviously the xylem is. So you can see here, there's some differences in the structure of the phloem and the xylem tubes. The phloem tubes have these funny looking plates, and they're called sieve plates. Okay, and a sieve is something that kind of filters stuff out and allows small amounts of things to go through. Like a coffee filter is kind of like a sieve. Okay, so these sieve plates, what they do is they make sure that big crystals of sugar don't form in the in the phloem sap, because that can happen. Okay, and if that crystallization process starts, it accelerates. All right, and the crystal will grow. So these sieve plates break those crystals, and they do it because the crystal will land right here, and then there'll be the weight of all the sap on top of it that pushes it and essentially crushes it against the sieve plate, breaking it into small enough pieces that they can get through the holes, and then the sap will flow better. Okay, so that's essentially what the sieve plates will do. All right. Okay, so xylem transports water up the plant. Okay, it's located in the center. I would say that's probably two things we should know. Okay, what it does, where it is, and the other thing we should know is, okay, that we get this happening by an osmotic pulling force. Okay, and then of course that works in conjunction with our hydrogen bonds and the polar nature of water here. Here's cohesion, here's adhesion, okay, keeping the water molecules from falling back down the stem. Okay, is that something I'd probably ask about on a unit exam? I have asked that every year. I have taught this course every semester. It has been in the written response. Okay, so make sure you know what does the xylem do, what does it carry, and how does it do that. Okay, that's something you're definitely going to need to know. And the same is true for its counterpart, the phloem. Okay, the phloem transports the sugars, and it's on the outside, and it uses the force of gravity, because that's free, okay, to pull that stuff down to the roots, where the sugar is obviously needed, because the roots can't carry out photosynthesis. There's no sunlight in the dirt. Okay, and it does mention here, okay, that there is some osmosis and diffusion still required, and that's if the sap starts to get thick. Osmosis automatically happens and water begins to move into the concentrated phloem sap to make it a little bit thinner, okay, and it runs a little bit better that way. In the wintertime, though, do we want much water to be in either part of the tree? No, because in the wintertime, if the water freezes, what happens to the tree? It expands, yeah, okay, and it'll crack the tree. Right? We see that if we get a really hard like freeze after the trees have become green, right? You'll actually see like branches break off. Okay, sometimes it's because lots of snow falls on the tree and it's just too much weight, right? But other times it's actually because the tree cracks from within, from the freezing of the water. Most of the time the water won't freeze unless it gets really, really cold because it has salts in it. The phloem sap doesn't freeze because it's got sugar in it. Okay, it acts kind of like an antifreeze to a point. Okay, in the dead of winter, okay, the plants lose their leaves. When they lose their leaves, there's no more pulling force for water. So water doesn't move into the xylem anymore. In fact, the tree dries out. Okay, the xylem empties, which is good. We don't want any water in there when it's 30 below. Okay, and the same is true for the phloem. Without the leaves, there's no sugar being produced. Okay, the phloem empties out, and now the tubes are all empty. Okay, and that protects the tree from any expansion kind of trauma. Okay, does that sort of make sense? Okay, that's typically why trees lose their leaves before the snow flies. Sometimes, so we know how it works up here, right? Sometimes we get snow in August. Sometimes, okay, but we typically don't get a long, hard freeze that we have to worry about till like October, November. All right. I want you guys to answer those questions there, those 5. Okay, and we'll go through them here in a few minutes. Okay, so let's quickly go over these here, guys, so we don't run out of time. So what processes are used in both intracellular transport and transport in multicellular organisms? Okay, so do plants use diffusion? Yeah, they do, okay? And they use it mostly in the leaf, right? Moving carbon dioxide, oxygen, and water from the spongy layer to the Palisade layer and vice versa, okay? That's where the bulk of the diffusion occurs. Do they use osmosis? Yeah, and how do they use that? What does osmosis usually transport? Water, okay, so are they using it to move water from the roots to the leaves? Yes, okay, that is its primary purpose, moving water from the roots to the leaves, okay, getting that stuff done. All right, if you were tapping a maple tree to harvest sap for syrup, which tissue are you going to tap? The phloem, because that's the one that has the sugary sap. No one will buy your syrup if you're tapping the xylem, because they're just going to be pouring water on their pancakes, and that's probably not desirable. Okay. Conversely, don't go out and find a maple tree and put the sap directly on your pancakes. You won't like how that works out either. It's actually a lot thicker than syrup is. There's a lot of stuff added to syrup. It's also you know, boiled and all that kind of stuff to make it safe. Yeah. Okay. I mean, if you were dying in the woods, you could, you know, chew on a maple tree, I guess. But okay. Number 3, in the leaf. Okay. Why are so many cells packed together near the surface of the leaf? Okay. And it's only on the top. Why are they only on the top? Okay, that's the cuticle. I'm thinking the ones that are straight up and down. Exactly. So they get more sunlight for photosynthesis. Guys, look at any plant. Unless that plant is sick, what side of the leaf do you see? The top. Okay? Because that's where the palisade layer is. That's where the most cells are concentrated. That's where we can carry out the most photosynthesis. The bottom of the leaf is a lot different. And that's where the stomates are. If this faces the sun, there's going to be a lot more water loss. Okay? I mean, there's still a cuticle there, but this is where the holes are. Okay? We don't want that side facing the sun. We want it in the shade. All right. Number 4. Would a plant be able to transport water to its leaves more easily or less easily on a humid day? So what does it mean, first off, if it's really humid? What is there a lot of in the air? Moisture, water. So does evaporation happen slower or faster on a day when it's really humid? Slower. So is it going to be harder or easier to carry out photosynthesis then? A little bit harder, yeah. Okay. Now in the jungle it still works, obviously, right? But we got that problem. Okay. If it's really, really humid, water doesn't evaporate nearly as well. Okay. Number 5, you have a plant that does not look very full. Okay, so it's only got like a few little stringy branches. Okay, so it kind of looks like this plant here, right? It looks kind of stringy. Okay, we want it to look more like this one, a little more full. Okay, what are some ways I could do that? Okay, well, let's say they're getting the same amount of water. I could trim it, yeah. Okay, if I trim it, I force it to grow from further back. Remember we had that, I showed you that example of what happens if something comes along and eats the plant, it grows from those other buds. Okay, that can make it look more full. If it's an indoor plant, you can turn it to face the sun. That's what I do with those two. One gets turned, one never gets turned. Okay, all right, we'll see you guys next week.